Daniel Hawthorne slammed his palm on the boardroom table so hard the water glasses trembled. "Get her out," he said, pointing directly at Emily Carter, the woman who had spent 18 years keeping his company alive. "She's done, today, right now." The room went silent. Then someone laughed, then another. Then the whole table erupted. Emily stood up slowly, picked up a small cardboard box, and walked toward the elevator without saying a single word. And in that moment, not one person in that room understood what they had just done. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Emily's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Emily Carter woke up at 5:15 every morning. Not because she had to, not because anyone asked her to, but because that was simply who she was, a woman who believed that the quiet hours before the rest of the world opened its eyes were the most honest hours of the day, hours where no one could take credit for your work, hours where the only voice in the room was the voice inside your own chest asking you whether you were doing things right. She had been waking up at 5:15 for almost 2 decades, and for almost 2 decades, Hawthorne Global Solutions had been the first thing on her mind the moment her eyes opened. Not her own dreams, not her own ambitions, not what she wanted for herself, the company, always the company. She would sit at her kitchen table in her small apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle. Not a luxury apartment, nothing fancy, just a clean, modest home with bookshelves covering every wall and a coffee maker that had been repaired 3 times because she refused to throw away something that still had life in it, and she would open her laptop and check the overnight reports, international servers, client security systems, operational transfer logs, risk management alerts. She would read through every number, every flag, every small anomaly that most people would have ignored, and she would begin quietly solving problems before the rest of the executive team had even had their first cup of coffee. This was her routine for 18 years. This was who Emily Carter was, the woman in the background, the woman who fixed things before they broke, the woman who made everyone else look brilliant. And for 18 years that arrangement had worked, until it didn't. The morning everything changed. Emily arrived at Hawthorne Global's Seattle headquarters at 6:45 earlier than usual because she had received an automated alert at 4 in the morning about a discrepancy in the Southeast Asia client database. A small thing, the kind of thing that would have gone completely unnoticed by anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for. But Emily knew. And the discrepancy worried her because it wasn't random. It was the 3rd time in 6 weeks that the same type of irregularity had appeared in that same cluster of accounts. She had flagged it twice before. Both times the reports had been acknowledged and then quietly buried. She took the elevator up to the 42nd floor, walked past the row of glass-walled offices, where the senior leadership team kept their trophies and their framed magazine covers, and she sat down at her desk and pulled up the full account history. The numbers didn't lie. They never did. Someone was moving money through those accounts in a way that looked legitimate on the surface but wasn't, not when you traced the full pattern, not when you followed every transfer back to its origin, not when you understood that 3 different shell structures were being used to disguise the same fundamental transaction. Emily's hands went still on the keyboard. She had suspected this for months, but now she had something more than suspicion. She had proof. She printed the documents, organized them into a folder, and picked up her phone to call the company's chief financial officer, a man named Gerald Marsh, who had been with Hawthorne Global for 12 years and who Emily had always believed was fundamentally decent. Gerald picked up on the second ring. "Emily," he said, "early morning for you." "Gerald, I need to meet with you today, before the board meeting. It's important." A pause, just a small one. But Emily had spent 18 years listening to the pauses between people's words, and this one told her something. "What's this about?" Gerald asked. "The Southeast Asia accounts. I found something." Another pause, longer this time. "Emily," Gerald said, and his voice had changed, dropped lower, become careful in a way that made her stomach tighten. "The board meeting this morning is going to cover a lot of territory. Maybe this could wait until—" "It can't wait," Emily said. "Gerald, the pattern I'm looking at, someone needs to know about this before we finalize any new contracts or expansion agreements. If we move forward without addressing this, we could be walking into a federal compliance nightmare." Silence. Then, "Come by my office at 8. Emily thanked him and hung up. She didn't know yet that Gerald had already been in Daniel Hawthorne's office at 6 that morning. She didn't know what they had discussed. She didn't know that the folder in her hands, the documents she had spent 3 weeks quietly compiling, was about to become the reason Daniel Hawthorne decided she needed to disappear from his company that very same day. She only knew that the numbers were wrong, and that she had a responsibility to say so. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Emily arrived at Gerald's office at 8 sharp, just as she said she would. She placed the folder on his desk and walked him through everything: the discrepancies, the pattern, the 3 separate shell structures, the timeline that traced everything back, approximately 14 months, to when Lauren Pierce had joined the company as vice president of strategy. Gerald listened. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions. He sat with his hands folded on the desk, and he looked at the documents, and he listened to Emily explain in careful and precise language what she believed was happening inside the company's financial architecture. When she finished, he was quiet for a very long time. "You're saying Lauren is involved," he said. "I'm saying the pattern started when Lauren joined and accelerated when she gained access to the Southeast Asia accounts," Emily said. "Whether that's coincidence, I can't say definitively, but combined with the acquisition proposal she presented last month and the investor reports from Q3, Gerald, the numbers don't add up. Someone has been inflating growth projections and using these accounts to cover the gap." Gerald picked up the folder. He looked at the first page, then the second. Then he closed it and set it back on the desk. "Emily," he said, "I appreciate you bringing this to me." Something in his voice made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Gerald, but I have to be honest with you. What you're describing, the conclusions you're drawing, these are serious accusations, and I think you may be reading patterns into data that have legitimate explanations." Emily stared at him. "I've been reading this company's data for 18 years. I know, and you do excellent work. But maybe, and I say this with respect, maybe the problem is that you've been here so long that you're not seeing the bigger picture. Lauren's strategy is complex. The structures she's using for the acquisition are sophisticated. They might look irregular if you're applying old frameworks." Emily felt something cold move through her, not anger, not yet. Something quieter and more dangerous than anger. Understanding. "You already knew," she said. Gerald did not answer. "You already knew," she said again, "and you told him. You told Daniel I was coming." Gerald's jaw tightened. "Emily, I think you should go get yourself a cup of coffee before the board meeting and give me my folder back." "Emily, give me my folder back, Gerald." He slid it across the desk. Emily picked it up, stood up, and walked out of his office without another word. In the hallway, she stopped and breathed. Just breathed. Looked at the glossy walls of the 42nd floor, at the photographs of Daniel Hawthorne, shaking hands with senators and CEOs at the framed mission statement that talked about integrity and innovation and a commitment to the communities they served. She had written that mission statement 14 years ago. Daniel had asked her to, because he said she had a way with words that made things sound like they meant something. She had believed at the time that they did. She did not go to the board meeting right away. Instead, she went back to her desk, made 2 copies of every document in the folder, placed 1 copy in a secure digital archive that she maintained separately from the company's primary servers, and sent the other copy to an encrypted email address that she had set up 3 months ago when her instincts had first started telling her that something was deeply wrong. Then she sent 1 message to a contact. She had a former colleague who now worked with a federal oversight agency, and the message said only, "The time may be coming. I'll be in touch soon." Then she straightened her jacket, picked up a notepad and a pen, and walked toward the boardroom. She did not know that Daniel had already made his decision. She did not know that the agenda for this morning's meeting had been quietly rewritten sometime between 6 and 8 o'clock. She pushed open the boardroom door and walked in. The room was full. All 12 members of the board were present. Daniel sat at the head of the table, flanked by Lauren Pierce on his right. Lauren, who was 34 years old and wore clothes that cost more than Emily's monthly rent, and who had arrived at Hawthorne Global 18 months ago from a hedge fund in New York, with a reputation for aggressive deal-making and very little else. On Daniel's left sat the company's general counsel, a thin man named Patrick Holloway, who rarely spoke in meetings, but whose silence Emily had learned was always deliberate. Emily took her usual seat near the middle of the table. Daniel didn't look at her. That was the first sign. In 18 years of board meetings, Daniel Hawthorne had always acknowledged Emily when she entered a room, sometimes warmly, sometimes perfunctorily, but always. It was a habit so consistent she had never consciously noticed it until the moment it was absent. The meeting began. For the first 30 minutes, everything proceeded normally. Quarterly reports, international expansion updates. The preliminary details of the acquisition. Lauren had been championing a mid-sized European technology infrastructure company that on paper looked like a perfect strategic complement to Hawthorne Global's existing portfolio. Emily listened carefully. She took notes. She noticed 3 specific claims in the financial projections that didn't align with the data she had reviewed that morning, but she held her observations and waited for the appropriate moment to raise them. Then Daniel said, "Before we move to a vote on the acquisition, there's something I want to address." He looked around the table. He still did not look at Emily. "We're at a turning point," he said. "The next phase of this company's growth requires a different kind of leadership, a more forward-thinking operational approach. And as part of that transition, I've made some decisions about our team structure." Emily's pen stopped moving. "Effective immediately," Daniel said, "Emily Carter's position as Chief Operating Officer is being eliminated." The room went very quiet. Then Daniel looked at her, and for the first time that morning their eyes met. Emily had known Daniel Hawthorne for 18 years. She had watched him negotiate billion-dollar contracts. She had watched him charm investors and senators and foreign dignitaries. She had watched him fire people before. She had even in the early years helped him craft the language for those departures, helped him find the words that were firm enough to be final, but gentle enough to preserve dignity. She had never expected to be on the receiving end of language she had helped write. "Emily," Daniel said, and his voice was smooth and practiced and completely without remorse. "You've been an extraordinary part of this company's history, but history is exactly the problem. We need someone who's looking at the future. Lauren has brought a perspective that the company needs right now, and frankly, having 2 competing operational philosophies at the senior level isn't serving anyone." "You're saying I'm being replaced by Lauren," Emily said. "I'm saying your role is being restructured." "That's the same thing, Daniel." A ripple went around the table. Someone shifted in their chair. Lauren Pierce was looking at her manicured nails. "We'll of course provide a generous severance package," Daniel continued. "And I want to be clear that this isn't a reflection of your contributions. You've been invaluable." "Stop." Emily's voice was quiet. So quiet that the room went even stiller to hear it. "Please don't finish that sentence. I've written that sentence. I know what it means and what it doesn't mean, and I'd rather we skip it." Daniel blinked. Just once. A small flinch that almost no one caught. But Emily caught it. "Can I ask a question?" Emily said. "Of course," Daniel said. "Have you reviewed the Southeast Asia account reports that I filed last night?" Silence. "I flagged a compliance issue." Emily continued, her voice steady, her eyes moving slowly around the table and landing on each face in turn. "A significant one. I met with Gerald this morning to discuss it. I want to make sure before we vote on any acquisition that every member of this board has seen those documents." She reached into the folder she had brought with her and began distributing copies. Daniel's hand came down flat on the table. "That's enough," he said. "The board has a fiduciary responsibility to—" "I said that's enough, Emily." "Daniel." She looked at him directly. "I have been in this company for 18 years. I have sat in this room through 2 financial crises, 3 SEC inquiries, and 1 attempted hostile takeover. I have never once raised a compliance issue that wasn't real. You know that. Everyone in this room knows that." Another ripple, this one louder. 2 board members reached for the documents she had placed in front of them. Daniel stood up. "I'd like you to leave the room," he said. "Daniel, Emily." His voice changed, dropped the smoothness, and became something harder and more honest. "You're no longer a member of this executive team. As of this meeting, you don't have standing to participate in board deliberations. Security will escort you to your office where you can collect your personal items, and then we'll arrange for HR to process your departure. I want this done today." Emily looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the mission statement on the wall outside, about the 5:15 mornings, about the 3 times she had stayed at the office past midnight rewriting operational frameworks that had saved this company from consequences it would never even know it had avoided. She thought about Gerald's face when she had looked at him and said you already knew. She thought about the folder of documents she had already copied and sent and secured. And then Emily Carter did something that no one in that boardroom expected. She smiled. Not a big smile, not a triumphant one, just a small, calm, completely genuine smile, the kind that comes not from cruelty, but from a deep and unshakable certainty. She gathered her notepad and her pen. She picked up her coffee cup, still half full, still warm. She stood up slowly, smoothed the front of her jacket, and nodded once to the room. "All right," she said. That was all. 2 words. "All right." She walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the hallway. Behind her, she heard someone at the table she would never know who start to laugh. A short burst of laughter quickly swallowed, but not quickly enough. And then another voice joined it, and another, and by the time the boardroom door swung shut behind her, the sound of that laughter was fully formed alive, ringing against the walls of the 42nd floor. They were laughing at her. After 18 years. Emily walked to the elevator and pressed the down button and stood very still while she waited. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. Her face gave away nothing. But inside her chest, something was happening that she had no language for, yet a quiet rearranging of everything she had believed about loyalty and patience, and the idea that good work done faithfully over time would eventually be recognized for what it was. The elevator opened. She stepped in. The doors closed behind her. And on the 42nd floor of Hawthorne Global Solutions, the board meeting resumed the vote on the acquisition moved forward, and not a single person in that room looked closely enough at the documents Emily had left on the table to notice what she had been trying to tell them. Not yet. She had 1 hour. That was what the security officer told her a young man named Marcus, who had the decency to look embarrassed by his assignment. He stood in the doorway of her office while she moved through it with the methodical calm of someone who had been preparing for this possibility for longer than anyone knew. "Take whatever you need," Marcus said. There's no rush. Take your time." Emily looked at him. He was maybe 26 years old. She had watched him grow from a nervous new hire into someone competent and trustworthy, someone who always held elevator doors and remembered people's coffee orders and showed up exactly when he said he would. "Marcus," she said, "how long have you been with the company?" 4 years next month. "Do you like it here?" He hesitated. In that hesitation, Emily read everything. "You don't have to answer that," she said. She packed her box slowly and deliberately. A small framed photograph, her and her sister at a lake house in Oregon, taken 12 years ago. A coffee mug she had owned since graduate school. A hardcover book on systems architecture that she had read so many times, the spine had cracked in 3 places. 3 small plants in ceramic pots that she had kept alive on her windowsill for 7 years. She left the awards. She left the plaques. She left the framed letter from a client CEO thanking her personally for saving a contract negotiation that had been hours from collapse. She left everything that said Hawthorne Global Solutions. She only took the things that said Emily Carter. At the door of her office, she stopped and turned back once. She looked at the desk she had sat at for 18 years, the window that looked out over Puget Sound, the worn patch on the arm of her chair from the angle at which she always rested her elbow. She memorized it, not because she wanted it back, but because she needed to remember exactly what she was walking away from so she would always understand the weight of the decision she was making. Then she picked up her box, walked past Marcus into the hallway, and headed toward the elevator for the second and final time that day. "Emily," Marcus said behind her, his voice low enough that no one passing by could hear. "For what it's worth, and I know it might not be worth anything right now, everyone on the operations team knows what you built here." Emily stopped. She didn't turn around. But she said, "Thank you, Marcus. That means something, more than you know." Then she got into the elevator. The doors closed, and Emily Carter rode down 42 floors in complete silence. Her small box balanced in both arms and thought about the encrypted documents sitting in a secure archive and the message she had sent that morning to a person who would know exactly what to do with them, and the smile she had allowed herself in the boardroom, the smile no one had understood. And she understood for the first time with complete and unambiguous clarity that she was not losing today. She was not losing. She was beginning. The lobby of Hawthorne Global was bright and wide, filled with the morning traffic of employees coming in for the day. Several of them saw her. Several of them knew immediately what the cardboard box in her arms meant. A few looked away, a few nodded. One woman, a junior analyst named Priya, who had worked directly with Emily for 2 years, put her hand over her mouth. Emily caught her eye and shook her head once gently. "Don't," that sheikh said. "Don't cry for this. This isn't the end." Then Emily Carter walked through the glass doors of Hawthorne Global Solutions and out into the crisp Seattle morning, and the door swung shut behind her, and the sound of the city rose around her traffic and voices, and the distant cry of seagulls coming off the water, and she took a long, slow breath of the cold air and thought, now, the real work begins. She did not go home right away. She drove to a coffee shop 3 blocks from the Hawthorne building, a small independent place she had been going to for years, where the owner knew her order and the corner table by the window was almost always available. She sat down, put her box on the chair beside her, and opened her laptop. The first thing she did was check the secure archive. Everything was there, complete, untouched, safe. The second thing she did was write a brief message to her contact at the federal agency. Not long, not dramatic, just the facts stated simply in the careful and precise language that Emily Carter had always used when the truth was the most powerful tool she had. The third thing she did was order a coffee and sit back in her chair and look out the window at the street outside where ordinary people were walking ordinary lives, and she thought about what it meant to have spent 18 years building something that didn't belong to you. She thought about every early morning, every ignored warning, every meeting where her voice had been acknowledged with a nod and then overridden by someone louder. She thought about the mission statement she had written on the wall of the 42nd floor, and she thought about what integrity actually meant when the people who claimed it used it only as decoration. She thought about Daniel Hawthorne, who had laughed when she left, or hadn't laughed but hadn't stopped the laughter, which was she knew the same thing. She thought about Lauren Pierce, whose confidence was enormous, and whose understanding of the company's actual infrastructure was almost non-existent. She thought about Gerald Marsh, who had looked at the evidence she placed in front of him and chosen protection over truth. And then she stopped thinking about all of them. Because here was what Emily Carter understood in the quiet corner of that small coffee shop, with her small box of personal belongings beside her, and 18 years of institutional knowledge inside her head, and a folder of documents already in the hands of people who would know what to do with them. She hadn't destroyed anything. She hadn't needed to. Daniel Hawthorne had spent years building a company on a foundation that he had never taken the time to understand, and the woman who understood it was walking away, and the only question left was how long it would take before the weight of all those unexamined choices came crashing through the floor. It would not be long. Emily already knew it would not be long. She sipped her coffee. She looked out the window. She breathed. And somewhere on the 42nd floor of a building 3 blocks away, the first fracture in Daniel Hawthorne's empire had already begun, quietly, invisibly, in exactly the way that all the most significant things begin. Not with a crash, with a silence. The particular silence of a woman who has stopped holding everything together, and a man who has no idea yet what that silence means. The coffee in Emily's cup had gone cold. She hadn't noticed. She was sitting in that same corner table at the small coffee shop 3 blocks from the Hawthorne building, but she was no longer looking out the window. She was staring at her laptop screen at a single line of text in her secure inbox, a reply from her contact at the Federal Oversight Agency. 4 words. Just 4 words, but they landed in her chest with the weight of something that had been a long time coming. The 4 words were, "Send me everything now." Emily's fingers hovered over the keyboard for exactly 3 seconds. Then she began to type. She didn't send everything in one file. She was too careful for that, too methodical, too aware of the way evidence needed to be organized to be useful rather than simply overwhelming. She packaged the documents in sequence, the original discrepancy reports, the pattern analysis, the timeline that traced the irregularities back 14 months to Lauren Pierce's arrival, the cross-reference transfer logs that showed 3 separate shell structures being used to disguise what was essentially the same transaction repeated across different accounts. She attached her own written analysis, 7 pages single-spaced, the kind of document she had always produced when something mattered clear, precise, emotionless on the surface and burning underneath. She hit send. Then she sat back and pressed her hands flat against the table to feel something solid. 3 blocks away in the building she had just left for the last time, a board vote was being taken on a $2.3 billion acquisition. The executives who had laughed when she walked out were now talking about the future, about growth, about the new era of Hawthorne Global Solutions under Lauren Pierce's visionary strategic leadership. They had no idea that the future they were so excited about had already begun to fracture at its foundation. But Emily knew. And the knowing sat inside her, not like triumph, but like grief, the particular grief of watching something you spent years protecting walk itself off a cliff. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was Marcus. His message said only, "They voted yes on the acquisition. Unanimous. I thought you should know." Emily stared at the message for a long moment. Then she typed back, "Thank you for telling me. Take care of yourself, Marcus." She put the phone face down on the table. And then, for the first time since she had walked out of that boardroom, Emily Carter let herself feel it, the full weight of 18 years, the accumulated exhaustion of being the person who held everything together, while everyone else took the credit for the stability she created. It moved through her like a wave, not violent but enormous, and she let it come and she let it pass, and when it was gone she felt something underneath it that surprised her. Not emptiness, clarity. She understood in that moment that she had been waiting for this, not consciously, not deliberately, but somewhere beneath her 5:15 mornings and her careful reports and her patient professional loyalty. Some part of Emily Carter had always known that this company was not built to last, not the way Daniel had been running it, not with the corners he cut and the warnings he ignored and the culture of noise and ego that drowned out anyone who tried to say something true. She had known. And she had stayed anyway, because she believed that one person who understood the foundation could keep the structure standing, even when the people at the top were determined to undermine it. She had been wrong about that. You cannot hold up a building whose owners are actively pulling out the support beams. You can only decide when to step aside. Emily closed her laptop, picked up her cold coffee, and drank it anyway. Then she took out a legal pad and a pen, and she began to write. Not a complaint, not a rebuttal, not a plan for revenge, a blueprint. She had been thinking about it for longer than she would have admitted, a different kind of company built on a different kind of principle. Not the loudest, not the most aggressive, not the one chasing the biggest headlines or the fastest growth numbers, but a company where the people who understood the foundation were also the people who had a voice, where transparency wasn't a marketing strategy, but an actual operating principle, where the numbers were real because the people reading them were honest. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. When she finally looked up, the coffee shop had filled with the midday crowd, and the noise around her had risen to the warm, ordinary hum of people living their lives, and Emily felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like herself. Not Emily Carter, Chief Operating Officer of Hawthorne Global Solutions. Just Emily, the woman who understood systems, the woman who saw patterns, the woman who it turned out had been building someone else's dream for so long that she had almost forgotten she was capable of building her own. Almost. She gathered her things, tucked the legal pad into her box beside the cracked spine book and the 3 small plants, and walked out into the Seattle afternoon. She didn't look back at the Hawthorne building. She didn't need to. What was happening inside it would find her soon enough. And it did. Sooner than even she had expected. 48 hours. That was how long it took. 2 days after Emily Carter walked out of that boardroom with her small cardboard box and her steady hands and her quiet, devastating smile, the first thing broke. It started as so many catastrophic failures do, with something small, almost invisible, the kind of thing that gets ignored in the middle of a celebration. The company's primary operational management system, a complex proprietary infrastructure that Emily had spent 4 years designing and implementing, and that she had spent the 14 years since maintaining, updating, and protecting, began behaving in ways that nobody on the technology team could immediately explain. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't a visible error. It was subtler than that, and therefore more dangerous. Certain authorization pathways began requiring additional verification steps that the system had not previously required. Financial transfer requests that should have processed automatically began generating review flags and routing themselves to secondary approval queues that nobody had set up. Access credentials for 3 of the company's most sensitive client databases began expiring on rotating schedules that didn't match any schedule the IT department had on record. The head of the technology team, a man named Raj Patel, who was competent and hardworking and had enormous respect for Emily, even though he hadn't always known how to express it, spent the first 6 hours of the problem assuming it was a routine maintenance issue. He assigned 2 of his best people to investigate. They came back with nothing useful, so he assigned 4 more. By the end of the first day after Emily's departure, Raj had his entire technology team working on a problem that none of them understood because none of them had ever needed to understand it before. The system had always simply worked. Emily had always simply made it work. Nobody had ever asked how because the answer was both complicated and to the executives who could have asked fundamentally uninteresting. Now the answer mattered enormously, and nobody had it. At 7 in the evening of that first day, Raj called Daniel Hawthorne directly. He did not want to. He was acutely aware that delivering this particular news on this particular day, the day after Daniel had triumphantly fired Emily Carter and announced the company's bold new direction, was the kind of thing that could end a career. But he was more afraid of staying silent. Daniel picked up on the 3rd ring. He was Raj could hear from the background noise at a celebration dinner. The acquisition vote had been toasted multiple times over, apparently. "Raj," Daniel said, his voice loose and confident. "What is it?" "I have a situation," Raj said carefully, "with the OMS." "What kind of situation?" "The kind that I'd normally bring to Emily Carter," Raj said. And then he stopped because he realized what he had just said, and he felt the silence on the other end of the line expand into something that had texture and temperature. "Emily Carter," Daniel said very slowly, "is no longer with this company." "I know," Raj said. "That's the problem." Another silence, this one colder. "Explain what you mean," Daniel said. Raj explained. He was methodical about it, laid out the symptoms, the timeline, the attempts to diagnose, the absence of any clear cause that his team had been able to identify. He explained that the operational management system was behaving as though it had been designed with contingencies built in for exactly this situation, contingencies that weren't documented anywhere. He could find that weren't part of any system manual. His team had access to, that appeared to have been implemented quietly and systematically over a period of years by someone who had thought very carefully about what would happen if the person maintaining the system suddenly wasn't there anymore. "I didn't say Emily's name again. He didn't need to." Daniel said nothing for a very long time. "Fix it," he said finally. "I'm trying to fix it," Raj said. "But Daniel, the architecture of this system it's not something my team built. We've been working within it, but we've never had to understand it from the ground up because Emily always—" "I don't want to hear her name," Daniel said. "Fix the system. That's your job. Do it." He hung up. Raj stared at his phone for a moment. Then he called the 2 most senior members of his team back into the conference room and said, "We're going to be here all night. Order dinner. We're going to take this system apart piece by piece until we understand what we're looking at." They were still there at 6 the next morning. They had made progress, real progress, the kind that comes from hours of concentrated, frustrated, humbling work. But what they had found in the architecture of that system was not reassuring. It was, in fact, the opposite of reassuring, because what they found buried in the operational framework that Emily had built and maintained and quietly evolved over 14 years were not just safeguards, they were mirrors. Every financial transfer above a certain threshold had built into its approval pathway a documentation requirement that generated an automatic record, a record that was stored not only in the company's primary servers, but in a secondary archive location that was not on the company's primary network. Every decision that required executive override had a corresponding log entry that captured not just the decision, but the authorization chain who had approved it at what level with what stated justification. Every compliance flag that had ever been raised and then closed without resolution had a timestamp and a record of exactly who had closed it and exactly what reason they had given. 14 years of decisions, 14 years of overrides, 14 years of choices made by executives who believed that the person managing the documentation was too focused on the details to understand the big picture. They had been catastrophically wrong. Raj sat in that conference room at 6 in the morning, looking at what Emily had built, and he felt something move through him that he didn't have an immediate name for. It was somewhere between awe and dread. He had always known Emily was exceptional. He had not known she was this. He had not understood that the quiet woman who showed up at 5:15 and left at 7 and always knew the answer when you asked her a question had also been for 14 years building something that would outlast her presence and tell the truth about everything that had happened in her absence. He picked up his phone and called Daniel Hawthorne again. It was 6:15 in the morning. Daniel answered on the first ring. He had not slept. "Tell me you fixed it," Daniel said. "I need you to come in," Raj said. "Raj, right now, Daniel. I need you to come in right now." Something in his voice must have carried the weight of what he had found, because Daniel didn't argue. He said, "I'll be there in 30 minutes. He was there in 20. And when Raj showed him what was in the system, not all of it, not the full depth of what Emily had built, but enough, just the top layer, just the first few feet of a very deep foundation. Daniel Hawthorne sat down in a conference room chair and said nothing for 4 full minutes. Then he said, "Is this admissible?" And Raj, who was a technology professional and not a lawyer, but who understood perfectly well what that question meant, said, "I think you need to call your legal team." Daniel stood up. Something had shifted in his face, the confidence gone, replaced by something rawer and more honest. Something that looked, Raj thought, almost like the beginning of fear. "Call Emily," Daniel said. Raj blinked. "I'm sorry." "Call Emily Carter. Tell her I want to speak with her." Raj looked at him for a moment. "Daniel, she was here for 18 years and you fired her in front of the entire board and let the room laugh at her while she packed her box. What exactly do you expect her to say when I call?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Tell her I'll double her salary. Tell her she can have her old position back. Tell her—" He stopped, pressed his hands against the conference table, breathed. "Just tell her I need to speak with her," Raj called. Emily picked up on the second ring. She was already awake. She had been awake for hours. "Emily," Raj said, "I'm sorry to call you. I know this is not something you want to deal with right now, but Daniel wants to speak with you. The system is—" He paused, searching for the right word. "The system is doing things we don't understand. We've been here all night. We need—" "I know what the system is doing, Raj," Emily said. Raj felt the hair on his arms stand up. "You built it to do this," he said. "Not an accusation, a statement of fact." "I built it to protect the company," Emily said. "The way it's always protected the company. The difference is that now the company has to protect itself without me standing in between." A silence. "Emily," Raj said, and his voice had gone quiet and earnest in a way that had nothing to do with corporate hierarchy and everything to do with one human being speaking honestly to another. "I need you to know that I'm sorry for what happened yesterday. It wasn't right." On the other end of the line, Emily was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Raj," she said. "That means something." "Will you talk to Daniel?" Another pause, longer. "Put him on," she said. Raj handed the phone to Daniel, who took it with both hands in a way that Raj had never seen Daniel Hawthorne hold anything carefully, almost cautiously, as though the phone itself might make a judgment about him. "Emily," Daniel said. "Daniel." Her voice was completely level. No warmth, no hostility, just the steady, factual tone of a woman who had already decided where she stood. "I need you to come back," Daniel said. "Whatever it takes, name your terms. No," Emily said. "One word, clean and complete. Emily, the system is. I know what the system is doing, and it's going to continue doing it, Daniel. That's what it was designed for, not to punish you, not to damage the company, but to ensure that every decision made inside Hawthorne Global is documented, recorded, and accessible to anyone who needs to see it, including federal investigators." A very long silence. "What did you say?" Daniel's voice had dropped to almost nothing. "I've already been in contact with an oversight agency," Emily said. "I sent them documentation yesterday, the irregularities in the Southeast Asia accounts, the Q3 projections, the acquisition proposal, all of it. I gave them what I gave you in the boardroom, the documents you threw on the floor and had me escorted away from." Daniel's breathing had changed. Raj could hear it from where he was standing. "Emily." Daniel's voice was different now, not confident, not smooth, not the voice of a man who believed himself untouchable. It was the voice of a man standing at the edge of something he had not seen coming. You don't understand the full picture here. The acquisition, the accounts, Lauren's strategy. It's complicated, but there are legitimate reasons for the structure we used. There are explanations." "I'm sure there are," Emily said. "And you'll have the opportunity to provide them. That's how the process works." Emily. And now something else had entered his voice, something that might, in a different context, have sounded like a plea. "We built this company together." The silence that followed was the longest of the entire conversation. When Emily spoke, her voice was still steady, but there was something in it now, not anger, not satisfaction, but something more complicated and more truthful than either of those. "No, Daniel," she said. "You owned the company. I built it. There's a difference. And I think you knew that difference somewhere, even if you never admitted it. Because if you hadn't known it, you wouldn't have been afraid of me." Daniel said nothing. "You didn't fire me because I was outdated," Emily continued. "You fired me because I found something, and you knew that if I stayed, the truth was going to come out on my timeline instead of yours. So you tried to remove me before it could. And in doing that, you removed the one person who was still standing between the decisions you made and the consequences they were always going to produce." Another silence, this one vast. "The system will keep running," Emily said. "It will keep documenting. It will keep routing decisions through proper channels. That's what it does. That's what it's always done. The only difference now is that I'm not there to manage it quietly in the background. Now everyone is going to see exactly what it's been recording." She paused. "Take care of your people, Daniel," she said. "Whatever happens to you and Lauren, the people who work in that building had nothing to do with your decisions. Don't let them be the ones who pay for it." And then Emily Carter hung up. Raj looked at Daniel. Daniel was still holding the phone. His face had gone through several different expressions in the last 30 seconds, and the one that had settled on it now was not one Raj had seen on him before. It was the face of a man who had just been handed a mirror by the last person he expected to still be holding one. "Get Patrick Holloway on the phone," Daniel said finally. His voice was almost normal. Almost. "And call the legal team. Tell them to come in this morning, all of them." Raj nodded and left the room. In the hallway, he stopped for just a moment and let out a long breath. He had been awake for over 24 hours. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical. And standing in that hallway with the low hum of the building around him, the building that Emily had spent 18 years quietly keeping alive, he thought about what she had said. "You fired me because I found something." I thought about the documents she had placed on the boardroom table. He thought about the way every single person in that room, including himself, had sat in their chairs and watched Daniel dismiss her and said nothing. He thought about the laughter. He thought about what it said about all of them that they had let that happen. He went back to his desk and started making calls. And across town in her small apartment in Capitol Hill, Emily Carter sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and her legal pad beside it, and she watched the time on her screen and thought about the people inside that building who were only now beginning to understand what the last 18 years had actually contained. Her phone was getting messages. Several members of the operations team, people she had worked alongside for years, people who had seen her escorted out of the building with a cardboard box, were reaching out. Not all of them, but enough. A message from a woman named Clara, who ran the compliance division. A message from 2 members of the finance team. A longer, more careful message from someone in contracts who said simply, "We never thought it was right. We just didn't know what to do." Emily read each message carefully and responded to each one. Not dramatically, not with the language of a person who had been vindicated or who was enjoying the unraveling. Just honestly. With the same directness and warmth she had always used with the people who actually did the work of keeping the company functional. She told each of them the same thing in different words: "You have done nothing wrong by doing your job well. Whatever happens next, your integrity is yours, and nobody can take it from you." She meant it. And as the morning deepened, and the messages kept coming, and the news filtering through her various contacts painted a picture of an executive floor in controlled panic, Emily Carter turned back to her legal pad and continued writing her blueprint. Because here was the thing that nobody in that boardroom had understood when they laughed. The thing that Daniel had failed to account for, even as he made the call to fire her. The thing that the laughter itself revealed, because it could only come from people who had fundamentally misread what they were dealing with. Emily Carter had not spent 18 years inside Hawthorne Global because she needed Daniel Hawthorne. She had spent 18 years there because she believed in what the company could be. She had believed for a long time that if she just stayed and kept the foundation solid and kept filing the reports and kept raising the flags, eventually the people at the top would look down and see what was actually holding them up. They had looked down, they had seen her, and they had fired her for it. So now she was going to build something where the people who understood the foundation were also the people making the decisions. Not a revolution, not a corporate fairy tale, just a company run by the principle that truth is not an obstacle to success, that truth properly understood and honestly applied is the only real path to anything worth building. She wrote until noon. Then she put the legal pad down, stood up, made herself a sandwich, and called her sister in Oregon. Her sister's name was Rachel, and she was a high school biology teacher, and she was the person who had always understood Emily better than anyone else in her life. Rachel picked up immediately. "I heard," she said. "Are you okay?" "I'm better than okay," Emily said. A pause. You sound different. You sound like you did in college, before you started at that place." Emily thought about that. "I think that's probably right," she said. "What are you going to do?" Emily looked at the legal pad on her table, at the pages of handwritten notes that were the earliest version of something she had been thinking about for years, without giving herself permission to pursue it. "I'm going to build something," she said. "Build what?" "Something that lasts," Emily said. "Something real." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm coming to Seattle this weekend." "Rachel, you don't have to." "Emily, my sister just walked out of an 18-year job with a cardboard box and a plan to change everything. I am absolutely coming to Seattle this weekend. Don't argue with me about this." Emily laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded and genuine, the kind she had not produced, she realized, in much longer than she cared to think about. "Okay," she said. "Come." They talked for another hour, about the company, about the future, about the things Emily had noticed over the years that she had never spoken aloud to anyone except in formal reports that disappeared into institutional silence. Rachel listened the way she always had, with total attention and the occasional sharp question that cut through everything peripheral and landed directly in the center of whatever mattered most. By the time Emily hung up, the afternoon had come, and the city outside her window was doing what cities do, carrying on indifferent to the particular personal upheavals of any single person within it. Emily sat at her table and thought about Daniel Hawthorne alone in a conference room with his lawyers. She thought about Lauren Pierce, who by now must be aware that the smooth trajectory she had been riding was beginning to curve in a direction she had not anticipated. She thought about Gerald Marsh, who had chosen protection over truth, and who was about to discover that protection had an expiration date. She thought about all of them, and then she opened a new document on her laptop. At the top she typed, "Everline Systems Founding Principles." She paused. Then she typed the first one, "No secrets. No hidden numbers. No employee is too small to be heard." She sat back and looked at those 2 lines on the screen. Outside, Seattle was going about its afternoon. Traffic was moving. People were buying coffee and walking dogs and having conversations about everything except the slow-motion collapse of a technology empire 3 blocks from a coffee shop where a woman with a cardboard box and a cracked spine book had 2 days ago made a decision that was already changing everything. Emily Carter pulled her laptop closer, and she began. The call came on a Thursday morning, exactly 9 days after Emily walked out of that boardroom. She was sitting at her kitchen table, still in the early hours, when the city hadn't fully woken yet, working through the operational framework for Everline Systems. Rachel had come and gone the weekend before, and the visit had done something important. It had made everything feel real in a way that a legal pad full of notes couldn't fully achieve on its own. Rachel had sat across from her for 2 days, asking the hard questions, pushing back on the assumptions, forcing Emily to defend every principle she had written down until what remained was not a dream, but an actual plan. Emily's phone buzzed against the table. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, Seattle area code. She almost didn't answer. She had been screening calls carefully since leaving Hawthorne. There had been a few attempts from people she recognized as Daniel's associates, smooth and indirect, probing for information she had no intention of providing. But something about this particular unknown number made her pause. She picked up, "Ms. Carter." The voice was female professional, carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to delivering information that changed people's lives. "My name is Sandra Webb. I'm a senior investigator with the Securities and Exchange Commission's Seattle field office. I'd like to speak with you about Hawthorne Global Solutions. At your convenience, of course, but I want to be honest with you, Ms. Carter. Our definition of convenience right now is fairly urgent. Emily set down her pen. How soon? She asked. Would today work? Emily looked at the legal pad in front of her, at the half-finished operational framework, at the coffee that was still hot for once because she had just made it. Yes, she said, today works. She met Sandra Webb at a federal office building downtown in a conference room that had the institutional quality of a place where consequential things happened without drama or decoration. Sandra was in her early 50s, sharp-eyed and unhurried, the kind of person who had learned over years of this work that patience extracted more truth than pressure. She had 2 colleagues with her. She introduced them by name and title. Emily shook their hands and sat down and folded her own hands on the table in front of her and waited. Ms. Carter, Sandra began, we've been looking at Hawthorne Global Solutions for approximately 7 months. What you sent us 5 days ago. She paused, and something shifted in her expression, not quite admiration, but recognition. What you sent us accelerated our timeline considerably. The documentation you provided is extraordinarily thorough. I spent 18 years learning what to document, Emily said. I can see that. Sandra opened a folder. I want to walk you through some of what we've found and have you confirm where you can what you witnessed directly versus what you inferred from the data. Of course. What followed was 3 hours of the most focused conversation Emily had participated in since leaving the company. Sandra and her colleagues were precise and systematic, moving through the evidence in sequence, never leading, never suggesting, simply asking Emily to tell them what she knew and how she knew it. Emily answered every question directly. She drew clear lines between direct knowledge and analysis. She corrected herself twice when she realized she had stated something with more certainty than her evidence supported. At the end of the 3rd hour, Sandra sat back and looked at her for a moment. Ms. Carter, she said, can I ask you something off the record? Emily nodded. Why didn't you leave sooner? Emily was quiet for a moment. She had asked herself this question many times in the 9 days since her departure. She had several answers, all of them true, and none of them complete on their own. Because I believed the company was worth protecting, she said finally, and I thought I was the only one who understood how to do it. That turned out to be partly right and partly a kind of arrogance I didn't recognize in myself at the time. Sandra nodded slowly. The arrogance of the indispensable. Yes, Emily said, exactly that. She drove home from that meeting with her hands steady on the wheel and her mind moving quickly through the implications of what Sandra had told her carefully, within appropriate limits as federal investigators do, but enough for Emily to understand that what was coming for Daniel Hawthorne and Lauren Pierce was not a warning or a fine or a quiet settlement that would disappear into the bureaucratic machinery. What was coming was real, and it was coming fast. She was pulling into her parking space when her phone rang again. This time she recognized the number immediately. It was Raj. Emily. His voice was tight in a way she had never heard from him before. Raj was one of the most unflappable people she had ever worked with, a man who responded to technical crises with the serene concentration of someone doing a crossword puzzle. The tension in his voice now told her more than his words were about to. Tell me, she said. The SEC showed up at the building this morning, Raj said, with federal agents. They came in through the lobby with credentials and went directly to the 42nd floor. They took computers. They took physical documents. They sealed the CFO's office. A pause. Gerald Marsh was escorted out of the building 40 minutes ago. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Gerald, she said, and the word carried everything. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just the weight of a man who had made a choice 9 days ago and was now living inside its consequences. Daniel is still up there, Raj continued. His lawyers arrived about 20 minutes after the federal agents. The whole floor is, Emily, I've never seen anything like it. People are standing in the hallways not knowing what to do. Half the executive team can't access their computers because the agents have them. The other half are on their phones with lawyers. What about Lauren? Emily asked. A short silence. Lauren left the building 2 hours before the agents arrived. Emily absorbed this. How did she know? She asked. I don't know, Raj said, but she knew. Emily thought about this. Lauren Pierce had not gotten where she was by being slow. Whatever else she was someone who watched for the tide turning and moved before it reached her feet. The question was whether moving early would actually save her, or whether she had simply traded one kind of exposure for another. "Raj," Emily said, "how are your people doing?" "Scared," he said honestly. "The whole operations team is scared. People are worried about their jobs, worried about, I don't know, Emily. People are asking me if the company is going to survive this, and I don't know what to tell them." "Tell them the truth," Emily said. "You don't know yet, but tell them that what's happening has nothing to do with them or with the work they do. Tell them that people who follow processes and do their jobs honestly are not the people who need to be afraid right now. And if they ask what happens to their jobs if the company goes under," Emily paused, "tell them that the people who built Hawthorne's operational infrastructure are the most employable people in this city, because it's true." Raj was quiet for a moment. She could hear in that silence that he was holding something back. "What else?" she asked. "Daniel is asking for you again," Raj said. "His lawyer called me this morning, before the agents arrived. They want to set up a meeting. Emily, they're saying that if you agree to come in and speak on Daniel's behalf about the context of certain decisions, that this could be characterized differently by the investigators. They're using language like clarifying the operational context and providing perspective on management intent." Emily felt something move through her that was not quite anger, but lived in the same neighborhood. "They want me to help him explain away the evidence I provided," she said flatly. "That's what it sounds like to me," Raj said. "I wanted you to know. I'm not passing the message along as a request. I'm passing it along because you deserve to know they're trying this." "I appreciate that, Raj." She breathed once steadily. "Tell anyone who asks that I have already cooperated fully with federal investigators, and that my cooperation consisted entirely of providing accurate documented information. That's what I can say." "Understood. And Raj, take care of yourself. What's happening in that building right now is not yours to carry." She hung up and sat in her car for a full minute before going inside. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for this. She had spent months building the documentation that made this moment possible, and yet sitting in the parking space of her apartment building, listening to the sound of her own breathing. Emily felt the complexity of what she had set in motion in a way that the intellectual preparation hadn't fully captured. She had not done this for revenge. She genuinely had not. She had done it because the alternative, staying silent, walking away with her severance and her privacy intact, while a fraudulent acquisition closed and investors lost money, and the people inside that building continued working for a company that was secretly rotten at the core, that alternative had never been available to her. Not really. Not given who she was. But knowing you did the right thing doesn't make the weight of it lighter. It just makes it bearable. She went inside and made coffee and called her lawyer. His name was David Okafor, and she had retained him the morning after her termination, not because she had been planning legal action against Hawthorne, but because she had known with the instinct of someone who had managed operational risk for 18 years that she needed professional guidance through what was coming. David was methodical and calm and had spent 20 years doing securities law, which meant he understood exactly what the documents Emily had sent to the SEC represented. "I heard," he said when he picked up, "federal agents at the building this morning. This is moving faster than I expected." "Faster than I expected, too," Emily admitted. "You'll likely be contacted for formal testimony at some point," David said. "Formal on record with their full legal team. Are you prepared for that?" "Yes." "Emily." He paused. "Daniel's lawyers called my office this morning." She closed her eyes. Of course they did. They were very careful about how they phrased things, but the substance of what they were asking is whether there's a version of your testimony that frames Daniel's decision-making as aggressive but not criminal. Whether the financial structures could be characterized as unconventional rather than fraudulent. Whether no, Emily said. "I told them that," David said. "I want you to know my answer was no before I even finished listening to the question, but I wanted you to hear that they tried." "What did they say when you said no?" "The lawyer, a man named Whitmore, very polished, very practiced. He said that Emily Carter's unwillingness to provide context would be noted and might affect the characterization of her own role in certain decisions." Emily felt something cold move through her. "He's trying to suggest I was complicit." "He's trying to create pressure," David said. "It's a standard move. It won't work because your documentation is exactly the opposite of what complicity looks like. Someone who was covering for Daniel Hawthorne does not spend 14 years building an automated record of every decision he made. But I want you to be aware that they will try this. They will try to make this about your character. Let them try, Emily said. She said it quietly without heat, just as a statement of fact, because she had spent 18 years being quiet about the things that mattered. She had filed reports that were buried. She had raised flags that were dismissed. She had sat in meetings and listened to her work described as outdated by people who had never once built anything. She had watched her mission statement hang on a wall, while the principles behind it were casually discarded. She had been patient for a very long time, and every day of that patience was documented. That afternoon, the story broke publicly. Not a leak, a full report published simultaneously by two major financial news outlets, citing unnamed sources within the company and within federal investigating agencies. The headline used words like alleged and under investigation, with the careful precision of journalists who knew exactly what they were writing but needed to maintain their protective language. But the substance was clear. The acquisition had been proposed on the basis of financial projections that had been manipulated. The Southeast Asia accounts had been used to obscure the gap between real performance and reported performance. Two senior executives were being investigated for securities fraud. Emily heard about the story from Rachel, who called from Oregon the moment she saw it. "It's everywhere," Rachel said. "It's on every financial news site. Emily, your name is in it." Emily sat up straight. "What do they say about me?" "They're describing you as a former senior executive who raised compliance concerns prior to her departure. One of the articles says, sources indicate that Carter's termination may have been directly connected to her discovery of the alleged irregularities." Emily breathed out slowly. Her name connected to this story was something she had thought about, had prepared for emotionally, in the abstract way you prepare for something you know is possible without fully believing it will happen until it does. "Are you okay?" Rachel asked. "I'm okay," Emily said. And then more honestly, "It's strange, having your name in a story like this, even on the right side of it." "The right side of it," Rachel repeated. "Emily, you're the reason the right side exists." After she hung up with Rachel, Emily's phone did not stop. Former colleagues, industry contacts she hadn't spoken to in years, a journalist who had somehow gotten her number and left a respectful voicemail asking if she'd be willing to speak on background. Two different technology companies, one in Seattle, one in San Francisco, whose representatives, with a kind of timing that would have been almost comic under different circumstances, reached out to ask if she might be interested in consulting engagements. She answered none of the calls from journalists. She returned 3 calls from former colleagues, the ones she trusted most, the ones who had worked directly with her in operations, and whose integrity she knew from years of daily proximity. She told each of them the same thing: she was doing well, she was focused on what came next, and she was grateful for their friendship. She did not call Daniel. She had said what she needed to say to Daniel Hawthorne in that phone call from his conference room. There was nothing left between them that a phone call could resolve. What was happening to him now was not something she had done to him. It was something he had done to himself over years, one compromised decision at a time. She had simply stopped standing between those decisions and their natural consequences. But that evening, sitting alone in her apartment with the noise of the story unfolding across social media and financial news channels, Emily allowed herself to feel the full weight of what it meant to watch something you had given 18 years of your life to come apart in public. Whatever Daniel had done, whatever Lauren had orchestrated, whatever Gerald had chosen to protect. Hawthorne Global Solutions had also been a place where thousands of ordinary people went to work every day and did their jobs with honesty and diligence and deserved better than what they were getting right now. She thought about Marcus, about Clara in compliance, about the junior analyst named Priya who had put her hand over her mouth when she saw Emily walking out with her box, about every person on the operations team who had sent her a message in the days since. Those people had not done anything wrong, and they were going to carry the consequences of decisions they'd had no part in making. That thought sat inside Emily like a splinter, and it became, in the quiet of that evening, the thing that sharpened her resolve about Everline Systems more than any other single factor. Not the satisfaction of being right, not the vindication of her analysis, not even the relief of the truth finally being undeniable. It was the image of all those people, decent, hardworking, and visible to the executives who had presided over their daily lives, who deserved to work somewhere better. Emily picked up her legal pad. She turned to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, "Who do we hire first?" And she began making a list. She was 3 names in when her phone rang. The number on the screen made her go absolutely still. It was Lauren Pierce. Emily stared at the screen for 4 full rings. Then she answered. "Lauren," she said. "Emily." Lauren's voice was not what Emily had expected. It was stripped of its usual polished confidence, not broken, not panicked, but reduced somehow to something smaller and more real. "I'm not calling about the investigation. I want to be clear about that up front. I'm not asking you for anything connected to that." "All right," Emily said carefully. "Then what are you calling about?" A silence, long enough that Emily thought the call might have dropped. Then Lauren said, "I want you to know that I was aware of what Daniel was doing before I joined the company." Emily said nothing. She picked up her pen and held it, not writing, just holding it. "Not all of it," Lauren continued. "Not the full structure, but the basics of how the projections were being managed I knew. He told me when he recruited me that there was a gap between the reported numbers and the actual performance, and that my job would partly involve building a strategy that could close that gap before anyone noticed. He framed it as a turnaround, as aggressive management of a temporary shortfall." "And you accepted that framing," Emily said. "I accepted it," Lauren said. And the flatness in her voice when she said it was the sound of a person who had stopped trying to explain something and had moved into the place beyond explanation. "I accepted it because the opportunity was significant, and because I told myself that if the strategy worked, the gap would close, and it wouldn't matter how it had started." "It always matters how it started," Emily said. "I know that now." Emily sat with this for a moment. Lauren Pierce calling her from wherever she was, her apartment a lawyer's office, some anonymous location where she was trying to figure out how much of her future she could still protect, telling her this. The question was why. "Lauren," Emily said, "why are you telling me this?" Another pause. Then, "Because I watched what happened in that boardroom. I watched Daniel throw you out and let that room laugh at you, and I—" She stopped, started again. "I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself you were being removed for strategic reasons and that you'd be fine. You'd land somewhere, you'd be fine people like you always land somewhere." She paused. "That's what I told myself. But the truth is, I knew what those documents you put on the table contained, and I knew why Daniel needed you out of that room, and I sat there and said nothing." The silence between them was the kind that held more information than words. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Lauren said. "I'm not stupid enough to think a phone call changes anything. But I'm telling you the truth, because it's the only currency I have left that's worth anything." Emily thought about the mission statement on the wall of the 42nd floor, about integrity as a principle versus integrity as a practice, about how easy it was to believe in something in the abstract and how much harder it was to act on it in the room when the pressure was real and the decision was now. "Lauren," Emily said finally, "I appreciate you calling, I do, but I need you to understand something. Whatever you've just told me, if you have information that's material to a federal investigation, you need to tell your lawyer and you need to tell the investigators, not me. Telling me doesn't change anything for you, and it doesn't change anything for the investigation." "I know," Lauren said. "Do you have a lawyer?" "Yes." "Have you told your lawyer what you just told me?" A pause. "Not everything." "Then that's the conversation you need to have tonight," Emily said. "Not this one." Lauren was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You're still trying to help, even now." "I'm trying to tell you the truth," Emily said. "That's not the same thing as helping." "Maybe not," Lauren said, "but it's more than I deserved." They hung up, and Emily sat with the phone in her hand and thought about what Lauren's call actually meant. Not for her, not for Emily's position, or her plans, or her ongoing cooperation with the investigation, but for the shape of the story itself, for what it revealed about how Daniel had operated not just the financial manipulation, but the human manipulation. The way he had recruited Lauren with the promise of a turnaround that he knew would require her complicity. The way he had used Emily's competence as a shield for years and then discarded her the moment she threatened to make the truth visible. He had needed both of them, had used both of them differently, had in the end betrayed both of them in the same fundamental way, treating people as instruments for his purposes, rather than as individuals with their own integrity and their own futures. Emily had known this intellectually for years. She had understood it about Daniel Hawthorne, but hearing it in Lauren Pierce's stripped bare voice made it newly vivid, made the waste of it land differently. Not just the financial waste, not just the legal consequences, but the human waste of talent, of potential, of the years that people had given to something that was never as real as they had believed. She set her phone down. She looked at the legal pad, at the list of names she had started, and she picked up her pen and continued writing. Because the antidote to everything she had just thought about was not bitterness, and it was not withdrawal. The antidote was the thing she had been doing since the moment she walked out of that elevator building. Something real on an honest foundation, with people who deserved better than what Hawthorne Global had given them. She wrote until midnight. Then she went to bed and slept soundly, the way you sleep when you have done everything you can do for one day and you know that tomorrow the work continues. In the morning, she had 47 messages on her phone. Most of them were from people she knew, people who had worked inside Hawthorne Global or adjacent to it, or who had watched the news break and thought of Emily Carter and wanted her to know they were thinking of her. But one message was different. It was from a man named Thomas Reeves. She had met him once briefly at an industry conference 3 years ago. He was the founder of a small technology firm that had been struggling for 2 years, a company built on genuinely good principles that had never found its footing, that had burned through 2 rounds of funding and lost its original leadership team, and was currently surviving on determination alone. His message said, "I saw the news. I've been thinking about calling you for 2 years. I know the timing might seem opportunistic, and I understand if you're not ready for anything yet. But I have something I think you should see. No pressure. Just whenever you're ready." Emily read the message twice. Then she called him back. He picked up immediately. He sounded surprised, as though he had genuinely not expected her to call so soon. They talked for 20 minutes. He told her about his company, its founding principles, its current situation, its team, the technology they had built that was solid and real, but that had never been properly managed or marketed, because the people who understood the technology were not the people who understood the business. Emily listened carefully. She asked 3 questions. His answers to all 3 were honest in a way she recognized the honesty of someone who knew their situation clearly and had stopped trying to dress it up. "What would you need," she asked, "to make this company into what you originally believed it could be?" Thomas Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Someone who understands how to build a foundation that can hold the weight of what we're trying to do. Someone who's done it before. Someone who honestly, Emily, someone like you." Emily looked at the legal pad on her table, at the founding principles, at the list of names, at the word Everline written at the top of the first page. "Tell me more about your company," she said. And while Daniel Hawthorne sat in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a building 3 blocks from a coffee shop, negotiating with lawyers about the limits of his exposure, and while Lauren Pierce was finally telling her attorney the truth, and while Gerald Marsh was learning what it meant to have chosen the wrong side of an 18-year-old decision, Emily Carter was on the phone asking the right questions, building the next thing. She had always known that the end of one thing was the beginning of another. She had simply been waiting for the moment when the ending was complete enough for the beginning to have room. That moment, it turned out, was now. Thomas Reeves had a company called Bridgepoint Technologies, and the first time Emily walked through its operational files, she understood 2 things simultaneously. The first was that the technology itself was genuinely excellent. Not flashy. Not the kind of thing that generated breathless press releases or made venture capitalists pound the table with excitement. But solid, carefully built the kind of infrastructure software that companies quietly depended on and quietly took for granted until it failed, and Bridgepoint's version almost never failed. Thomas and his team had spent 4 years building something real. That part was not the problem. The second thing Emily understood was that the company was approximately 90 days from collapse, not because of fraud, not because of the kind of deliberate financial manipulation she had spent months documenting at Hawthorne Global, but because of something almost sadder than fraud, simple, honest, exhausted mismanagement. Thomas was a brilliant engineer who had tried to also be a CEO and had discovered too late and at great personal cost that those 2 roles required fundamentally different skill sets. He had burned through his first funding round trying to build a product that didn't need to be built yet. He had spent his second round trying to fix the damage from the first. He had lost 3 senior employees who had seen the trajectory and made the rational decision to leave before the landing. What remained was a skeleton crew of 7 people, all of them talented, all of them loyal to Thomas in the specific way that people are loyal to someone they believe in, even when the belief is becoming costly, and a technology platform that was in Emily's considered assessment worth significantly more than anything currently attached to it suggested. She spent 3 days going through the files before she said anything to Thomas. On the 4th day, she called him. "I finished the initial review," she said, and his voice carried the particular tension of a man who had been waiting for a verdict he was not sure he wanted to hear. "The technology is real," Emily said. "The foundation is solid. You built something genuinely useful and you built it well." She heard him exhale. But you've been running the company like an engineer instead of like a business leader, which makes sense because you are an engineer. The problem is that the company needed both and you've only had one." "That's a diplomatic way of saying I made a mess of it," Thomas said. "It's an accurate way of saying you were the wrong person for one of the 2 jobs," Emily said. "That's not the same thing as making a mess. You built something worth saving. Most people in your situation don't have that." A silence. Then, "So what do we do?" "That depends on whether you're willing to do something that most founders find very difficult," Emily said. "What's that?" "Share control," she said. "Real control. Not in the way people talk about sharing control when they mean they'll listen to advice and then do what they were going to do anyway. Actually share the decision-making, the operational authority, the financial oversight. Build it into the structure from the beginning, so it's not a question of personality or relationship. It's just how the company works." Thomas was quiet long enough that Emily began to wonder if she had miscalculated. Then he said, "Emily, I called you because I've been watching what you built at Hawthorne for years from the outside and wishing I had someone like you inside my company. If I was going to push back on the idea of shared control, I would have hired someone who'd tell me what I wanted to hear. I didn't. So yes, whatever it takes." Emily looked at the legal pad on her kitchen table, at the name she had written at the top, Everline Systems. She had been thinking about this differently, about starting entirely from scratch, finding a building, hiring, from zero, building everything herself from the ground up. She had thought that was what she wanted, the clean slate, the fresh start with nothing borrowed from anything that had come before. But sitting with Thomas's words in her ear and his company's operational files open on her laptop, Emily recognized something she had not expected to feel, the particular excitement of a problem that was exactly the right size and shape for the skills she had spent 18 years developing. Not a problem of corruption or fraud or the deliberate dismantling of integrity. Just a good thing that needed someone who understood foundations to come in and build the structure around it. "I need 2 weeks," she said, "to finish my own planning and to have my lawyer review your corporate structure. Then I want to sit down with you and your team and go through everything together. Not just the finances, everything. The way decisions get made, the way information flows, the way employees are brought into the picture or kept out of it, all of it." 2 weeks, Thomas repeated. "Yes, absolutely. Emily, thank you. I know this isn't—" He stopped, tried again. "I know you have a lot of options right now. The fact that you're considering this means something to me." "Don't thank me yet," Emily said. "Wait until we've had the hard conversations. Then tell me if you still feel that way." She hung up and sat for a moment in the specific quiet of early morning when the city was just beginning to stir and the light was coming in low and the day had not yet accumulated its weight. She thought about Daniel Hawthorne, who was currently, according to David Okafor, in the middle of what promised to be an extremely protracted legal process. She thought about Lauren Pierce, who had, according to a brief, careful message from her own lawyer, made the decision to cooperate with federal investigators and provide testimony about the full scope of Daniel's instructions to her when she joined the company. She thought about Gerald Marsh, whose cooperation had been secured even more quickly, which told Emily everything she needed to know about how Gerald had ultimately chosen to resolve the conflict between self-protection and loyalty. She did not feel triumphant about any of this. She felt the way she had felt when she hit send on the encrypted message to the SEC, certain that she had done the necessary thing, and quietly, privately devastated by the fact that it had been necessary. She picked up her phone and called David Okafor. "I need to talk to you about Bridgepoint Technologies," she said when he answered. "Thomas Reeves. I want to understand the legal structure of a potential acquisition and what it would look like to restructure the entity under a new operating framework." David's voice sharpened with professional interest. "You're moving fast." "I've been planning this for years," Emily said. "I'm just finally doing it." "Tell me what you're thinking," she told him. All of it. The Everline principles she had written out on the legal pad, the operational framework she had been developing, the way she envisioned the company's structure, not just as a business arrangement, but as a physical embodiment of the ideas she had been trying to implement inside Hawthorne Global for 18 years without the authority to actually make them real. David listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Emily," he said, "I've been a corporate lawyer for 22 years. I've seen a lot of business plans. What you're describing is either going to fail very publicly or become something people study in business schools." "I know," Emily said. "I'm choosing to believe it's the second one." "Good," David said, "because so am I. Let's make it bulletproof." They spent 2 hours on the phone that morning. David asked the hard legal questions: liability structures, equity distribution, governance mechanisms, the specific language needed to make the transparency principles Emily had outlined enforceable rather than merely aspirational. Emily answered each one precisely because she had been thinking about these questions for long enough that the answers were already there, waiting for someone to ask. By the time they hung up, the bones of something real were taking shape. And then 12 days later, the twist that Emily had not seen coming arrived in the form of a phone call from someone she had never expected to hear from again. The call came on a Tuesday. She was sitting in Thomas Reeves's conference room with 3 members of his team, walking through the operational audit she had promised when her phone vibrated in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. The name there made her go very still. Patrick Holloway, Hawthorne Global's general counsel, the thin, quiet man who never spoke in meetings, whose silence Emily had always believed was deliberate. She excused herself and stepped into the hallway. "Patrick," she said. "Emily." His voice was the same as she remembered, measured, careful, the voice of a man who chose every word with the precision of someone who understood that words were legally consequential. "I appreciate you taking this call. I know I have no particular claim on your time or your goodwill." "What do you need, Patrick?" A pause. "I need to tell you something. Not as Hawthorne Global's general counsel, that relationship is being terminated as of end of week, for reasons I think you can imagine. I'm speaking to you as a private individual, one who has some information that I believe you should have." Emily leaned against the hallway wall. "I'm listening." "The board," Patrick said. "The remaining board members, the ones who weren't directly involved in the financial irregularities. They've been in emergency session for the last 4 days. There's a faction 3 members led by a woman named Constance Morrow, who you may not know, that is pushing very hard for the company not to be dissolved but restructured. They believe the underlying business has value that would be destroyed by a full collapse. They're looking for someone to come in and lead a recovery." Emily said nothing. "They've been asking about you," Patrick continued. "I want to be clear that I'm not here as their representative. I'm not authorized to make you any offer. But I thought you deserved to know that the conversation is happening, and I thought you deserved to hear it from someone who could tell you the truth about the motivation behind it, which is partly genuine belief in the company's underlying value, and partly, I'll be honest, a group of people trying to salvage their own reputations by associating with yours." Emily absorbed this. "You're telling me so I don't walk into it blind." "Yes," Patrick said simply. "Why?" she asked. "Why does it matter to you whether I walk in blind or not?" A long pause. When Patrick spoke again, his voice had changed, shed the lawyerly precision and become something more tired and more human. "Because I was in that boardroom," he said, "when Daniel fired you, when they laughed. I was there and I said nothing, and I have thought about that every single day since. I can't undo it. But I can make sure you have the full picture before someone tries to use you." The silence between them stretched long enough to be honest. "Thank you, Patrick," Emily said. "For what it's worth," he said. "The work you did inside that company it was the most professionally admirable thing I've witnessed in 30 years of corporate law. I should have said that while it mattered." They hung up, and Emily stood in that hallway and thought about what it meant that Patrick Holloway, who had sat in silence through every meeting and every override and every buried warning for years, was now calling her at personal risk to make sure she wasn't ambushed. What it said about the accumulated weight of watching something wrong happen slowly and choosing not to speak until the cost of silence finally outweighed the cost of saying something. She thought about Hawthorne Global's board, about a woman named Constance Morrow she had never heard of pushing for a recovery, about the strange, complicated possibility that the company she had spent 18 years inside might somehow survive in some form changed, stripped of the people who had corrupted it but structurally intact. She went back into the conference room. Thomas and his team were waiting, and she looked at their faces. 7 people who had bet on something real and stayed with it even when it got hard, and she made a decision. "I want to tell you something," she said, "about what's happening with Hawthorne Global and what it might mean for what we're building." She told them. Not everything, not the private details of ongoing investigations or the specifics of what Patrick had shared, but the shape of it. The possibility that the board was looking for a recovery leadership. The question of whether Everline Systems in its early form might have a relationship with the remains of something she had spent 18 years building. When she finished, Thomas looked at her steadily. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to do what's right for the people inside that building," she said. "Not the executives, not the board's reputations, the people who came to work every day and did their jobs honestly." "And what does that look like practically?" asked Clara, who was sitting across from her. Clara, who had sent Emily a message in the days after her departure, who had left Hawthorne herself 2 weeks after the federal investigation began, and who Emily had quietly added to her list of people she wanted around when she started building something new. "It looks like us being very clear about who we are and what we stand for before anyone else decides to define it for us," Emily said. "We are not a rescue operation for Hawthorne Global's reputation. We are Everline. Our principles are written and public and non-negotiable. If a relationship with whatever Hawthorne becomes serves those principles and serves the people who need serving, we consider it. If it doesn't, we don't. That's the only framework." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Thomas said, "I think that's exactly right." And the 7 people around that table nodded, and Emily felt something settle in her chest. The particular settling that happens when the room you're in contains the right people and you are finally doing the right work. 3 days later, David Okafor called her with news that rearranged everything again. "The SEC has filed formal charges," he said. "Daniel Hawthorne, Lauren Pierce, 2 members of the board. The charges include securities fraud conspiracy to commit securities fraud and obstruction. The filing happened this morning." Emily sat down. "Gerald," she asked. "Gerald Marsh has entered a cooperation agreement," David said. "He's providing testimony. They've given him a significantly reduced exposure in exchange. And Lauren's cooperation has been formalized as well. Her lawyer negotiated hard. She's looking at reduced charges, potentially no prison time, depending on the testimony she provides." Emily thought about the stripped, bare voice on the phone, about Lauren saying the truth is the only currency I have left that's worth anything. "The charges against Daniel," Emily said. "What's the realistic outcome?" David was quiet for a moment, not the hesitation of someone who didn't know the answer, the pause of someone deciding how to deliver it accurately. "He's facing the kind of exposure that doesn't resolve quietly," David said. "Multiple counts, federal prosecution. The documentation trail is Emily. The documentation trail is extremely thorough." She knew. She had built the documentation trail. "When will this become public?" she asked. "It already is," David said. "It went up on the SEC's public filing system 40 minutes ago. It's going to be everywhere within the hour." It was everywhere within 30 minutes. Emily's phone became a constant, urgent buzz of messages and calls. Financial journalists, technology industry contacts, former colleagues from Hawthorne, people she hadn't spoken to in years who had seen the filing and thought of her immediately. She let most of it go to voicemail. She answered 3 calls, David, Rachel, and Raj, who called from what sounded like the lobby of the Hawthorne building with noise and tension in the background. "It's chaos up here," Raj said. His voice was controlled, but barely. "People are panicking. Half the floor is trying to figure out if they should be calling lawyers. The other half is standing around in groups not knowing what to do. Emily, they need to hear from someone they trust." "What do you want me to do, Raj?" "Come in," he said. "Not officially. Not as anything to do with Hawthorne or the board or any of that. Just come in and talk to the operations team. 50 people who spent years working alongside you and who are terrified right now. You don't have to say anything about the investigation. Just be someone they know." Emily thought about David, about the ongoing legal proceedings, about the complications of walking back into a building that was currently the subject of a federal investigation. She called David immediately after hanging up with Raj. "I want to go into the building," she said. to speak with the operations team, not in any official capacity, just to be there. Is there any legal issue with that?" David was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "As long as you're not discussing the investigation, not representing yourself as having any current authority, and not accessing any company systems, no. There's no legal barrier to visiting former colleagues." "I'm not going to access any systems," Emily said. "I just want to talk to people who are scared." "Then go," David said. "And Emily, be careful with what you say about next steps. Don't recruit from inside an active investigation subject." "I know," she said. "I know how to do this." She drove to the Hawthorne building and walked through the lobby for the first time since the morning she had walked out with her cardboard box. Marcus was at the security desk. He looked up and something moved across his face. Not shock, something more complicated than shock, something that looked like relief. "Emily," he said. "Hi, Marcus," she said. "Is it okay if I go up?" He looked at her. He looked at the desk. He looked at the credentials panel that would normally require her to badge in. Then he said, "The badge readers are having some technical difficulties today," and he pressed the manual release for the turnstile. Emily looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. He nodded. 42nd floor it's not a great scene up there, but the ops team is on 38. They've kind of gathered in the main conference room." She took the elevator to 38. When she walked into that conference room, 53 people looked up at her simultaneously. The room was crowded and tense and smelled of too many people in a closed space, the particular atmosphere of a group that has been frightened together for long enough that the fear has become communal. And then slowly, one person started to clap, then another. And within seconds, the room was on its feet, and Emily stood at the front of it and felt something move through her that she had no language for. Not pride, not vindication, but the deep, aching fullness of being truly recognized by people who knew exactly what you had done and what it had cost. She raised her hand. The room went quiet. "I'm not here officially," she said. "I'm not here to tell you what's going to happen to this company because I genuinely don't know. I'm not here to recruit you or ask anything of you. I'm here because Raj called and told me you were scared, and I couldn't think of a good reason not to come." Silence. "What I can tell you," she continued, "is what I know to be true. The work you did inside this company was real. The problems that are unfolding right now are not the product of your work. They are the product of decisions made by people who were far above you, in rooms you weren't invited into, about things you had no knowledge of. The investigation will establish that. The record will show it." A hand went up. A young woman in the back, someone Emily recognized from the data analysis team. "What do we do?" she asked. "About our jobs. About what do we actually do right now?" "You do your jobs," Emily said. "You show up. You document your work. You behave with the same integrity you've always brought to this place. Because the people who will eventually decide this company's fate, whether it restructures, whether it's acquired, whether some version of it survives, those people will be looking at whether the underlying operation is sound. The best thing you can do for yourselves and for each other is to make sure the answer to that question is yes." Another hand. A man named Howard from the systems team, who Emily had worked alongside for 9 years. "Did you know?" he asked, not accusatory, genuinely asking. "When you were here, did you know how bad it was?" Emily looked at him directly. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "I found evidence of specific irregularities, and I tried to report them through proper channels. When that failed, I escalated to federal authorities. That's what the record shows. What I didn't know, what none of us fully knew, was the full depth of it." Howard nodded. He seemed to need that, to need the truth stated plainly by someone he trusted to tell it plainly. She stayed for 45 minutes. She answered every question she could answer honestly and told them clearly when a question was one she couldn't or shouldn't answer. She did not make promises. She did not paint an optimistic picture she couldn't support. She simply told the truth in the same careful and direct way she had always operated, and the room received it the way people receive something they have been thirsty for without knowing how thirsty they were. When she finally walked back toward the elevator, Raj followed her out into the hallway. "Thank you," he said. They needed that." "I know," she said. "Emily." He lowered his voice. "There's something you should know. Constance Morrow, the board member who's been pushing for restructuring, she's been asking about you, specifically. She wants a meeting." Emily thought about Patrick's phone call, about walking in blind. "I know," she said. "I'll call her." Raj blinked. "You already knew." I know more than people give me credit for, Emily said. That was always the problem. She got in the elevator. She called Constance Morrow from the lobby. Constance picked up immediately as though she had been waiting. Her voice was direct and businesslike and carried the specific energy of someone who had been in enough crises to have stopped being frightened of them. "Ms. Carter," she said, "I've been hoping you'd call." "I heard you've been looking for recovery leadership," Emily said. "I want to be transparent with you about where I stand. I am not available to lead a recovery for Hawthorne Global Solutions. I am in the process of building something new, and that process is my priority." A brief silence. "I understand," Constance said, and she did not sound defeated by this. She sounded like someone who had expected it and had another question ready. "Then let me ask you a different question. If what we're trying to do here isn't about saving Hawthorne Global's name, if it's about preserving the operational infrastructure and the workforce and the client relationships that have nothing to do with what Daniel and Lauren built, would you be willing to consult, not lead, advise, occasionally, as an outside perspective?" Emily thought about the 53 people in the conference room upstairs. She thought about what she had said to them, about showing up and doing the work. She thought about her own principles, about the difference between walking away from something corrupt and walking away from people who deserved better. "Send me the specifics of what you're proposing," Emily said, "in writing. My lawyer will review it. If it's consistent with what I'm building and genuinely serves the people inside that operation, we can have a further conversation." "That's all I'm asking," Constance said. They hung up, and Emily walked out of the Hawthorne building for the second and truly final time, and the afternoon had turned cool, and the light had gone golden, the way Seattle light does in the late part of the day, and she walked to her car and sat in it for a moment and thought about the shape of things. How the same woman who had been laughed out of a boardroom 3 weeks ago was now the person everyone needed to call. Not because the laughter had been wrong. It had been wrong, deeply, irreversibly wrong, but because the laughing had been so catastrophically based on a misunderstanding of who she was and what she had built that its reversal was almost mathematical, almost inevitable. She had not made this happen. She had simply stopped preventing it from happening. There was a difference, and it was the most important difference she knew. She started her car. She drove back to Thomas Reeves's office where 7 people were waiting for her because they had chosen to trust her, and she had chosen to trust them back, and where a company called Everline Systems existed now in documents and legal frameworks and the committed intentions of people who understood what they were building and why. She walked in, and Thomas looked up from his desk. "How was it?" he asked. "Hard," she said honestly, "and necessary." "Are you okay?" Emily set her bag down. She looked at the legal pad on the corner of the desk, her legal pad, the one she had brought from her kitchen table to this office, because this was where the work was now. At the founding principles written in her own handwriting at the top of the first page. "I'm more than okay," she said. "I know exactly where I'm going." And she sat down and opened her laptop and went back to work. Outside, the city continued. Inside, something new was taking shape quietly, methodically, with the same patient and determined energy that had once held an empire together and was now finally building something that belonged entirely to itself. The first year of Everline Systems was the hardest thing Emily Carter had ever done. Not because it failed, because it almost did 3 separate times, and each time it didn't fail was the result of decisions made in the middle of the night by people who had chosen to believe in something that had not yet proven itself to the world. Emily had built other people's companies for 18 years. She knew how to hold a structure together. What she had not fully understood, until she was living inside it, was how different it felt to hold together something that was entirely yours, where every crack in the foundation was a crack in something you had personally designed, and every near miss was a lesson written in the specific language of your own miscalculations. The acquisition of Bridgepoint Technologies closed on a cold morning in November, 4 months after Emily had first called Thomas Reeves back. David Okafor handled the legal framework. Thomas and Emily had spent those 4 months in an almost continuous conversation about structure, about governance, about the specific mechanisms that would make the principles Emily had written on a legal pad in her kitchen into something with legal teeth and operational reality. They argued, genuinely argued the way people argue when they both care about the outcome and neither one is willing to accept a version that doesn't actually work. Thomas argued for speed, Emily argued for soundness. They compromised repeatedly and imperfectly in the way that all real collaboration requires. On the morning the acquisition closed, Thomas shook Emily's hand across a conference table covered in signed documents, and then, because he was Thomas, and not a man who expressed things through formality alone, he said, "I need you to know that this is the best decision I have ever made." Emily looked at him. "We haven't done anything yet," she said. "Ask me again in a year." "I will," he said, "and my answer will be the same." She believed him. That was what surprised her, that she actually believed him, this man she had known for 4 months, this engineer who had built something real and had the self-awareness to recognize what he couldn't do alone. She had spent 18 years inside a company whose leader had believed himself capable of everything and had consequently surrounded himself with people who either agreed or were silenced. The experience of sitting across from someone who genuinely wanted a counterweight, who had sought one out deliberately, was so different from anything she had known inside Hawthorne Global that it took her weeks to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. The other shoe did not drop. What dropped instead was the first client contract under the Everline name, a mid-sized logistics company in Portland, whose technology director had worked with Emily years before at Hawthorne, and who had heard through the particular informal network of people who pay attention to people who are worth paying attention to that she had started something new. The contract was not large. It was, by the standards of what Emily had managed at Hawthorne, almost modest. But it was real, and it was clean, and it was built on exactly the foundation she had written about on that legal pad the morning after she was fired. She called Rachel the night it was signed. "First client," she said. Rachel made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "How do you feel?" "Like I built the first wall of a house," Emily said. "Like there's an enormous amount left to do, and I know exactly how to do it." "That's better than how you sounded 6 months ago." 6 months ago I was still figuring out if the foundation was level," Emily said, "and now I know it is." She heard Rachel smile through the phone. "Then build, Emily, just build." The second client came 3 weeks later. The third, 2 weeks after that. None of them were the result of aggressive marketing or a polished sales operation. Everline didn't have one yet, and Emily had made a deliberate decision not to build one until the operational systems were solid enough to support what a sales operation would promise. Instead, each new client came through the same channel, word of mouth, from people who knew people who had worked with Emily Carter and understood what that meant. By the time the first quarter of Everline's existence closed, the company had 7 clients, 22 employees, 14 of whom had come directly from Hawthorne Global's operations team people. Emily had personally invited after the legal review period for the investigation had cleared their involvement and a financial position that was, by the standards of a startup in its first year, genuinely healthy. And it was exactly then, when Emily was beginning to feel that the foundation was holding, that Daniel Hawthorne's trial began. She had known it was coming. David had kept her precisely informed at every stage of the legal process. She had given her formal deposition 8 months earlier in a conference room with 5 lawyers and 2 federal investigators, and had answered every question with the same careful directness she brought to everything. She had not dramatized. She had not editorialized. She had stated what she knew, how she knew it, and where the documentary evidence could be found to support it. The deposition had lasted 6 hours. Afterward, she had driven home and made dinner and called Rachel and then gone to bed and slept for 10 hours straight, the deep, unconscious sleep of someone who has discharged a weight they had been carrying for a very long time. But knowing the trial was coming and having it actually arrive were 2 different experiences. The morning the trial began, Emily was in the Everline conference room with Thomas and Clara and 3 other members of the leadership team working through the Q2 operational review when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. A message from David. It started, "You okay?" She typed back, "Yes, call me tonight." She put the phone face down on the table and returned her attention to the Q2 numbers. Clara, who had worked alongside Emily for 9 years at Hawthorne and who could read her face with the accuracy of long familiarity, said nothing. But after the meeting, she stopped Emily in the hallway. "The trial?" she asked. "Yes. Do you need anything?" Emily thought about this. What she needed was to keep working, to keep building, to continue demonstrating through the daily practice of actually running an honest company that the principles she had written on a legal pad were not aspirational language, but operational reality. "I need the Q2 client satisfaction data by end of week," she said, "and I need the proposal for the Chicago expansion to be ready for review by Thursday." Clara looked at her for a moment, then she nodded. "Done," she said. The trial lasted 11 weeks. Emily did not attend. She followed through media reports and through David's regular updates, getting the facts without the theater. She read the coverage carefully and absorbed what it told her, not just about Daniel and Lauren and the specifics of what they were charged with, but about how the story of Hawthorne Global was being told in public and how her own role in that story was being characterized. She was described consistently and across multiple outlets as the whistleblower, the insider who had built the documentation trail that made the prosecution possible, the former chief operating officer who had tried to report the irregularities internally and been fired for it and then escalated to federal authorities. All of this was accurate. None of it was the whole story. The whole story was 18 years of early mornings and buried reports and meetings where her voice was heard and then overridden, and a slow, patient accumulation of knowledge and documentation, and the specific kind of loyalty that survives disillusionment because it was never based on the person at the top, but on something more durable than that. The whole story was not the kind of thing that fit neatly into a trial narrative or a news article. It was the kind of thing that lived in the details, in the cracked spine of a book on systems architecture, in the worn patch on an office chair, and 47 messages from people who had watched her walk out with a cardboard box and needed her to know they had seen it and they knew what it meant. She did not give interviews. Several journalists wrote articles about her anyway, based on court documents and the accounts of former colleagues and the publicly available record of what had happened. She read those articles carefully and noted what they got right and what they simplified, and she filed the information away in the part of her mind that cataloged the difference between the story people tell about something and the thing itself. 6 weeks into the trial, the twist that nobody saw coming came from the direction nobody had expected. Lauren Pierce took the stand. Emily learned about this from David, who called her at 7 in the morning with a voice that carried the controlled excitement of a lawyer watching a case develop in ways that exceeded his already high expectations. "Lauren's testimony," he said. "Emily, I need you to understand that what she said today changes the entire frame of the prosecution's case." "Tell me," Emily said. "She corroborated everything in your documentation," David said. "Every financial structure, every override decision, every buried compliance report. But she also added something that wasn't in your documentation because you couldn't have known it from inside the company." Emily waited. "Daniel had an exit strategy," David said. "A planned exit. Lauren testified that from approximately 2 years before you were fired, Daniel had been deliberately preparing to liquidate his personal position in the company to extract his own wealth from the company structure before the financial gap became impossible to conceal. The acquisition, Lauren was championing the European acquisition that the board voted through the day you were fired, was not intended to close the gap in the company's finances. It was intended to create enough apparent value in the short term to allow Daniel to execute his exit before the collapse." Emily sat very still. "He was planning to let it fall," she said. "According to Lauren's testimony, yes, the people who would have been left holding the consequences were the investors, the remaining board members, and every employee inside the company." Emily thought about the 53 people in the conference room, about Marcus at the security desk, about Priya, who had put her hand over her mouth, about Clara, who was currently in the Everline conference room running Q2 numbers with the same focused integrity she had brought to every job she had ever held. "He was going to walk away," Emily said, "and let all of them carry it." "That's what the testimony indicates," David said. The thing that moved through Emily in that moment was not anger. It had moved too far past anger to still be called that. It was something more like the final, complete understanding of a system she had been analyzing for 18 years, the moment when all the data points aligned and the pattern became not just visible, but undeniable. Daniel Hawthorne had not simply been reckless. He had not simply made bad decisions driven by ego and the intoxication of wealth. He had been from the beginning someone who understood exactly what he was doing and had decided that the people around him were acceptable collateral. He had fired her not because she threatened the company. He had fired her because she threatened his exit. She had been the one person inside that company who understood the foundation well enough to see before anyone else could that the structure above it was being deliberately weakened. And Daniel had known that. had known she would eventually see it, had seen her starting to see it in the Southeast Asia account reports, and had moved to remove her before she could become the obstacle between him and the door. "Emily," David said, "are you there?" "I'm here," she said. "There's one more thing," Lauren said. David continued more carefully now. "She testified that in the meeting where Daniel made the decision to fire you, the meeting the morning before the board meeting," Daniel said, and I'm going to quote from the court transcript directly, "Emily Carter is the only person in this company who can stop what we're doing, so she has to go, today, in front of everyone, so there's no question about whether she's still a factor." The silence on the line was complete. "He knew," Emily said. "He knew exactly who you were," David said, "and what you were capable of, and he was afraid of it." Emily pressed her hand flat against her desk and breathed. She thought about the boardroom, about the laughter, about the way she had walked to the elevator with her box and pressed the down button and stood very still, and how she had understood in that moment that she was not losing. She had been right. She had been right, not because she had planned it, or because she had wanted to bring him down. She had been right because a man who is genuinely afraid of you is not a man who has won. He had known who she was. He had laughed anyway. And in laughing, he had made the precise mistake that people always make when they confuse the removal of a threat with its elimination. He had not eliminated Emily Carter. He had freed her. "David," she said, "thank you for calling. How long until the verdict?" "The prosecution is wrapping their case by end of next week," David said. "Defense will need at least 2 weeks after that, so 6 to 8 weeks probably." "All right," she said. "Keep me informed." She hung up and sat in the particular quality of silence that follows the kind of information that rearranges everything you already knew. Then she picked up her phone and called Thomas. "Can we move the expansion timeline up?" she asked when he answered. Thomas made a sound of surprised laughter. "Good morning to you too. Move it up how much?" 3 months, she said. "I want to be in Chicago by fall." "Emily, we talked about this. The operational framework for the Chicago expansion needs at least—" "I know what it needs," she said, "and I know we can be ready in 3 months if we prioritize it now. I want to prioritize it now." A pause. Thomas was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was running calculations, not hesitating, just processing. "Why now?" he asked. Emily thought about how to answer this, about Lauren's testimony, about Daniel's plan, about the word factor and what it meant that the most powerful man in her professional world had looked at her and used that word. "Because I've been patient long enough," she said, "and because the foundation is solid, and because the people who need what we're building are waiting for it, and because I'm done moving at the pace of people who were afraid of what I might do if I moved faster." Thomas was quiet for another moment. Then, 3 months, he said. "Let's do it." The verdict came on a Thursday morning 7 weeks later. Emily was in the middle of a client call when her phone lit up with a message from David. She finished the call, she always finished what she started, and then she looked at the message. "Guilty, all counts, Daniel Hawthorne. Lauren Pierce, reduced charges per agreement 2 counts. Sentencing in 60 days. She sat with it, not with triumph, not with the specific satisfaction that revenge would have produced if revenge had ever been what she was after, but with something quieter and more complicated, the recognition that a true thing had been confirmed, that the system, imperfect and slow and sometimes maddening in its indirectness, had ultimately done what systems are supposed to do when someone builds the record carefully enough and provides it honestly enough and trusts the process enough to let it run. She called Rachel. "Guilty," she said when Rachel picked up. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you feel?" "Like it's over," Emily said. "The part that was ever about Daniel anyway. The rest of it." She looked at the Everline documents open on her laptop, at the Chicago expansion framework, at the 22 names on the employee roster, all of them people she had personally chosen, all of them people who had come to this company because they believed in what it stood for. "The rest of it is just beginning." "Good," Rachel said. "That's the right answer." 2 weeks after the verdict, a letter arrived. Not an email, an actual letter, handwritten on plain paper from a correctional facility in Washington state. Emily recognized the handwriting immediately. She had seen it on documents and memos and the occasional personal note for 18 years. She stood in her kitchen and opened it. Daniel Hawthorne had written 3 paragraphs. The handwriting was neater than she expected, more deliberate, the writing of a man with nothing left to hurry toward. The first paragraph said that he had instructed his lawyer to forward her the letter because he did not expect her to accept a call, and he thought she deserved the choice of whether to read what he had to say. The second paragraph said that he had spent a considerable amount of time in the weeks since the verdict, thinking about the specific words he had used in that meeting the morning before the board meeting, the words that Lauren had quoted in her testimony. He wrote that he had meant them as a statement of professional threat assessment, that he had understood Emily was the person most capable of stopping him. He wrote that he wanted to say now that he understood this differently than he had then, that what he had identified as a threat was he now recognized simply someone doing her job with more integrity than he was doing his. The third paragraph asked one question: was I ever really in control? Emily read the letter twice. She folded it carefully. She put it on the table. She made herself a cup of coffee and drank half of it standing up the way she did when she was thinking hard about something. Then she sat down and wrote a reply. 2 sentences. She wrote them by hand because the letter deserved a handwritten reply, and because there was something in the act of writing by hand that required you to commit to what you were saying before you said it. No backspace, no revision, just the words and the pen and the page. She wrote, "You owned the company, but you never understood it." She sealed the envelope and put it by the door to mail in the morning. Then she opened her laptop and went back to work. The Chicago expansion launched on a Tuesday in October, 13 months after Emily Carter had walked out of a boardroom with a cardboard box and been laughed at by people who believed they had just won something. The launch was not a party. It was not a press release. It was an operations meeting in a new office with 12 employees, 6 from the Seattle team, 6 new hires in Chicago. All of them gathered around a table with the Everline founding principles printed and framed on the wall behind Emily's head, where Emily walked through the operational framework for the Chicago operation, and answered questions, and listened carefully to the concerns that the new hires raised and took notes on every one of them. After the meeting, a young woman named Sophia, one of the Chicago hires who was 28 years old and had joined Everline specifically because of the company's published founding principles, stopped Emily near the door. "Can I ask you something?" Sophia said. "Of course," Emily said. "The first principle," Sophia said. "No employee is too small to be heard. Does that actually work in practice? Because I've worked at 2 companies that had mission statements like that, and it was—" She stopped. "It was decoration." Emily looked at her for a moment. She thought about this mission statement she had written 14 years ago on the wall of the 42nd floor of a building 3 blocks from a coffee shop in Seattle. She thought about the distance between a principle stated and a principle practiced. She thought about the 18 years she had spent inside a company that had confused the two. "It works if the people running the company believe it when no one is watching," Emily said. "Not when they're being evaluated, not when it's comfortable, when it's inconvenient. When the thing the smallest person in the room is saying is the thing the most powerful person in the room doesn't want to hear. That's when it counts. That's when you find out if you actually believe it or if you just printed it on a wall." Sophia held her gaze. "And you believe it." "I built this company on it," Emily said. "Ask me in 10 years if I've kept it. That's the real answer." Sophia nodded slowly. "Fair enough," she said. And she went back to her desk and started work, and Emily stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room, at the 12 people who had chosen to be here, who had looked at what Everline stood for and decided it was worth betting on, and she felt something move through her that she had no single word for. It was the feeling of a foundation holding, of weight being distributed correctly, of a structure that was built to last because the people who built it understood that the structure was not for them. It was for everyone who would stand inside it. She went back to her desk. She had 3 client calls in the afternoon, a board review in the morning, and a proposal from a 4th potential Chicago client sitting in her inbox that she wanted to read before the end of the day. She had the Chicago Expansion Operational Manual to finalize, and a conversation with Thomas about the Q4 growth projections that she suspected was going to be one of their better arguments, because she thought he was being too conservative, and he thought she was moving too fast, and they were both probably a little bit right. She had work to do, the specific, concrete daily work of building something real. She pulled up the proposal in her inbox and began to read. Outside the city was doing what cities do. Inside Everline Systems was doing what Emily Carter had always known a company could do if it was built on the right foundation, not the fastest, not the loudest, not the one chasing the headline or the biggest number or the moment of triumph that made everyone in the room feel important. Just the one that did what it said it would do every day, honestly, by people who understood that the foundation was not a starting point you left behind when you reached success. The foundation was the whole point. It always had been. 5 years later, when a journalist writing a long feature about Everline Systems asked Emily Carter what she considered the most important decision she had ever made, Emily thought about it for a genuine moment, not performing consideration, but actually thinking the way she always did before she answered something that deserved a real answer. Then she said, "Walking out of that elevator with my box, not fighting, not begging, not trying to explain myself to people who had already decided not to hear me. Just leaving and trusting that what I had built would still be true, whether or not they acknowledged it." The journalist wrote that down. Then she asked, "And was it true?" Emily looked out the window of the Everline offices, not the small borrowed space of the early months, but a real building now, 3 floors, Seattle and Chicago, 140 people who came to work every day inside a structure that Emily had designed from the foundation up, and that had so far held every weight that was placed upon it. She looked back at the journalist. "You're sitting in the answer to that question," she said. The journalist looked around the room, at the people working at their desks, at the framed founding principles on the wall, at the name above the door. She smiled. She understood. Because some things do not need to be explained, they only need to be built, and the woman who builds them does not need to be the loudest person in the room, or the most aggressive, or the one whose name is on the magazine covers, or whose image is associated with the word success, in the way the world has always preferred its success stories, sudden and dramatic and announced. Some things are built quietly, over years, by someone who shows up before everyone else and leaves after everyone else and understands the foundation better than anyone and never once confuses the noise at the top of the structure for the thing that is actually holding it up. Emily Carter had always known the difference. And in the end, in the only end that actually mattered, that knowledge was the only power she had ever needed.